So we're quickly moving on to the next paper in this session that will be presented by Mr. Terrell Howard, the Central Bank of Barbados. Global competitiveness and economic development, identifying the key pillars for Latin America and the Caribbean nations. The discussion will be Ms. Dr. Small, economist at the Caribbean Development Bank. Yes. Good morning.
All right, so good morning, everyone. My presentation today looks at competitiveness in Latin America and the Caribbean. Competitiveness is a very topical concern in many conversations today, and this study is just one that adds to that discourse in the context of the Latin American and the Caribbean region. Though this study was primarily conducted by myself, I would like to thank Professor Winston Moore, who provided some guidance and support, especially with the methodology. So, to start off, the World Economic Forum defines competitiveness as a set of institutions, policies, and factors that determine the level of productivity of a country. But why is competitiveness a hot topic right now? Well, looking back, the onset of globalization has increased nations' access to opportunities all over the world. However, new trends are emerging and the global economy continues to evolve. Also, to shift in global dynamics are creating a lot of uncertainty, which gives rise to a more fluid environment. So, to remain relevant in the global economy, countries ought to reposition themselves rather than run the risk of being left behind. And this is where the concept of competitiveness comes in, strengthening the fundamentals to drive productivity and ultimately development. So this then leads to the aim of the study, and it is to identify which of these fundamentals are most critical for the region's development. So one of the tools that is used to assess competitiveness at the national level is the Global Competitiveness Index by the World Economic Forum. It assesses performance across 12 pillars, which are listed at the bottom of the screen. And these pillars are built using over 100 micro and macro performance indicators. In 2018, the indicators were updated to align with the realities of the 21st century. However, the GCI was paused because of the pandemic and it didn't resume afterwards. Nevertheless, it still offers useful insights into many of the contemporary issues facing nations today. So, while each pillar contributes to the overall competitiveness of a nation, a stage of development hypothesis was proposed by the WEF, and it states that the importance of the pillars changes as countries develop. And it outlines three main economic stages, which are effective driven, efficiency driven, and innovation driven economies. So this diagram helps us to visualize the hypothesis. The first stage captures the low income countries and it outlines four basic requirements, which are institutions, infrastructure, macroeconomic stability, and health and primary education. As income rises, nations progress to the next stage. So now these six pillars become important. And at the final stage, countries are expected to be more advanced, so business sophistication and innovation are critical. So looking at the region's performance, we see that there are significant gaps compared to the top global performers across many of the pillars, and particularly in infrastructure, institutions, goods market efficiency, labor market efficiency, business sophistication, and innovation. Also, to the differences between the region's best and worst performers, that speaks to the degree of regional inequalities that are present. And the root causes have been long documented in the literature. So, for example, with respect to institutions, the authors commented on the long history of ineffective legal systems. Infrastructure, Sarabrisky 2017 noted underinvestment in new projects as well as in adequate maintenance. As it relates to the goods market, undertrading in the region is said to be caused by logistical bottlenecks and insufficient export diversification. In the labor market, workers face lower wages, poor working conditions, a lack of sufficient social protection, according to these authors. In terms of business sophistication, authors point to financing constraints and regulatory burdens. And for innovation, it is constrained by the lack of skills, technology, and funding. So, given these gaps, some countries in the region would have leveraged the GCA as a part of their national strategies to track performance over time and to identify areas for reform, all in an effort to boost their competitiveness. However, some academics would have critiqued the GCA, deeming it unreliable for guiding policy, since some indicators rely on subjective survey data. Nevertheless, I believe that opinion based indicators can still offer some valuable insights, especially when hard data is largely unavailable, and that is a problem that we face in the region. So, so linking competitiveness to economic outcomes, when we talk about competitiveness, the endogenous growth theory naturally comes to mind because it combines both macro and microeconomic system drivers into a comprehensive framework. The pioneers, this is the wrong, sorry. The pioneers, Romer and Lucas, emphasized the role of human capital in knowledge in driving growth. And the theory was extended by other authors who emphasized the importance of other internal factors, many of which are captured in the GCA. Several studies have also assessed the relationship between the GCI and economic growth or development, and results have largely found a positive relationship. However, there aren't many studies which examine the impact of the 12 GCA pillars. One example is a study by Calazzo and Taib 2015, which looked at the determinants of competitiveness in fast-growing economies in the LAC region, and they found that technology was the most significant pillar, specifically broadband connectivity, but they did not provide further insights into the competitive dynamics of the LAC region beyond this finding. The study also did not account for the different developmental stages of countries, and this should be an important consideration given that countries at different income levels face different constraints and opportunities. So this study therefore updates their work in a quest to determine which areas of competitiveness are most relevant for the region, and in doing so, I would have considered the different developmental stages. All right, so on to the data and methodology. For the dependent variable, I use GDP per capita as a proxy for economic development, and the scores from the 12 GCI pillars were used as the independent variables. The sample consists of 25 LAC countries on the GCI between the period of 2007 and 2017. In terms of the model, I specified a panel regression with country fixed effects and as well as the year effects, the year fixed effects. Here, the Y represents the economic development proxy, and X is a vector of the pillars. So, to account for the different developmental stages, the countries were categorized based on their income thresholds outlined by the WEF, and a dummy variable was introduced to capture this. And then interact the stage dummy with each pillar to allow its relevance to change according to the group stage. So a set of stage-specific regressions were estimated where each regression speaks to the relevance of the pillars for countries in that particular stage. And I deliberately took this approach for the stage-specific results rather than splitting the already small sample in order to preserve degrees of freedom. So given how the GTA is constructed, there is a strong possibility of collinearity among the pillars, and with a short time span, putting all 12 pillars into the model at the same time can lead to overfitting. A possible way around this is to test the pillars according to their stage relevance and then gradually feed in the pillars. However, once the pillars from the other stages are added to the model, the results may become unstable. So to address this, I adopted a model averaging approach, specifically the Bayesian averaging of classical estimates proposed by Sala and Martin et al. 2004. So generally, model averaging approaches address uncertainty by averaging the OLS estimates over many candidate models with different variable combinations, and it is a widely used technique in many growth models. So given that there are 12 GCI pillars, the total number of candidate models is given by 2 to the k, which equates to just over 4,000 models. The good thing about Bayes is that it requires a specification of an expected model size, and that helps to reduce overfitting as it tends to favor more parsimonious models, and it is somewhat robust to multicollinearity. So given that I'm trying to identify the most relevant pillars for the region, as my prior belief, I assume that half of the pillars are important, such that there's a 50-50 chance that each pillar forms part of the true model. So with this assumption, the expected model size is given by k on 2, which is 6, and the prior inclusion probability is of each variable is given by pi, which is 0.5. And this prior inclusion probability will be important for interpreting the results. The prior model probability is therefore expressed by this equation here, which basically says that each model is equally likely of being the true model before seeing the data. Now, after seeing the data, the prior model probability is updated with the posterior model probability, which is the new chance that a particular model is the true model. And the equation just multiplies the prior weight by the marginal likelihood and normalizes it across all candidate models. Base then assigns a posterior inclusion probability to each regressor, which is basically the chance that a specific variable is part of the true model after seeing the data. It is given by the sum of probabilities of every single model that contains that specific variable or pillar. So to determine which of the competitiveness pillars are relevant for economic development, pillars with a posterior probability above the prior are treated as robust, and this is because their probability of inclusion rises once the data is observed, highlighting the pillars' power in explaining development. Base also provides a posterior mean and a posterior variance for each model, for each pillar. So on to the results. In the general specification for the LAC region, 6 pillars were found to be robust, and these are infrastructure, macro stability, goods market efficiency, labor market efficiency, business sophistication, and innovation. The data strongly supports macro stability and innovation and business sophistication, since they all have a posterior of 1. So while the results for the macro stability is expected, the outcomes for innovation and business sophistication are interesting, since that these are the region's weakest areas of competitiveness. So for innovation, it suggests that there is significant untapped potential across the region, supporting the sentiments of Letterman 2014, who argued that innovation isn't widely encouraged in the region. Casanova suggests that the region should focus on alternative forms of innovation, specifically those that emphasize the importance of business models, social impact, as well as collaboration in order to drive development. For business sophistication, even though the posterior is 1, the post-mean coefficient is negative, and the labor market pillar is also robust but negative, similar to the findings of Calauzo. And these negative outcomes point to significant structural weaknesses in these pillars. Cadena et al. Noted that some of the region's most productive firms have contributed negatively to growth in the past due to limited access to finance, regulatory burdens, and skill shortages. Another result that is worth highlighting is the robustness of the goods market pillar. And these authors would have argued that enhancing interregional trade can protect LAC economies from the risks associated with global fragmentation. And this is a real and current concern given recent experiences with COVID supply chain disruptions, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as well as the recent shifts in US trade policies. So it is not surprising that this pillar emerged as a robust determinant of growth in the region, development in the region. In terms of the stage-specific specifications, at the first stage, infrastructure was the only robust pillar for factor-driven economies, confirming just 1 out of the 4 basic requirements expected at this stage. And this is important because many nations at this stage have limited access to basic services and they exhibit low standards of living. Calderon 2004 argued that in order to reduce poverty in low-income countries, high-quality infrastructure should be a top priority. Now, the second specification for efficiency-driven economies, nations across the region, the most nations across the region sit in this stage, according to Arts and Amoros 2008, and this still holds for my sample, so you see much hasn't changed over time. So quite like the general specification, results confirm the robustness of macro macroeconomic stability, innovation, goods market, and business sophistication. Technology also emerged as a robust pillar with the second highest posterior, and that echoes many calls for the region to embrace and make better use of technology. The reality is that given their middle income status, countries in this stage have more resources and the ability to leverage technology more broadly. In terms of the hypothesis, only two out of the six efficiency enhancing pillars are found to be robust determinants. At this stage three, with the innovation driven economies, the robust pillars were macro stability, innovation, labor market, institutions, and tech. Unlike the previous specifications, um, institutions now show up as a robust determinant. According to ASAM 2022, strong institutional frameworks are key for attracting investments and opportunities. And this point is especially crucial for countries at this stage because as economies advance, investors and partners are expecting transparency and accountability. And this builds the necessary confidence that resources are being well managed and that contracts are awarded fairly. So, to summarize the findings of this study, the aim was to identify which areas of competitiveness are relevant for development in the region, and these were found to be macroeconomic stability, innovation, business sophistication, goods market efficiency, labor market efficiency, and infrastructure. And while infrastructure was the sole robust pillar for countries at stage one, the robust pillars for the other two stages generally align with the overall results for the region. Additionally, although there were some differences at the stage level, the study does not fully support the stage of development hypothesis and proposed by the WEF, as many of the pillars hypothesized to be critical for stage one and stage two were not robust. Overall findings give rise to a key policy consideration, and that is the coordination of policies. According to Jafar Nijad et al. 2011, the competitiveness pillars are not independent. So it's likely that progress in one area can rely on or influence another. So policymakers should therefore ensure that policies align across all the pillars to maximize the developmental impact. As it relates to measuring competitiveness, with the discontinuation of the GCI, regional economies can look at designing their own indices, either at the regional or national level. The GCA can be used as a reference point, and it can be tailored to the specific developmental priorities of the region, so resources can be allocated efficiently. Unfortunately, many LAC nations don't have the resources to address these necessary gaps by themselves. So targeted action is essential. So a regional effort is therefore needed along with the support of multilateral development banks to help LAC nations boost their competitiveness and successfully drive development in the region. So with that said, this is the end of my presentation and thank you for listening.
All right, thank you, Chair. Let me first start by, congratulating Terrell on an excellent presentation. I think the question is timeless, and therefore this body of work is timely. The paper tries to address an important issue that I think is top of mind among policymakers in the Latin American and Caribbean region. It is the center of a lot of the debate that is taking place now, right? Questions around, what are the key drivers of productivity and competitiveness, and how do these translate ultimately into economic growth and development? I think the paper made some useful contributions to the existing literature, whereas previous work would have looked at sort of high-level indices of competitiveness. Even the GCI, previous papers would use the aggregate GCI. This paper started to dig into the weeds a little bit to try to identify the specific drivers, what specific components of the GCI and the extent to which these components have differential impacts on development. And I think that's an extremely useful exercise. I think, there is another contribution to the paper is that it sort of conditions on the level of development of countries. And again,
it gets at the fact that there's no one size fits all, right? So there are some um, aspects of competitiveness that might be more fruitful in some contexts rather than others. And so I think that was also another useful contribution. The paper also recognized some limitations in terms of the empirics. When you're using models and you're trying to estimate the impact of numerous independent variables, you run into this curse of dimensionality and questions around model appropriateness. And so I think the use of the Bayesian averaging classic estimate approach that attempts to deal with that lends some robustness to the overall estimation. Again, I think that's a useful contribution from the paper. Let's kind of summarize the results. The results suggest that macro stability, innovation, business sophistication, goods market efficiency, infrastructure, and labor market efficiency are critical determinants of economic development in the region. That's a lot, right? And so it suggests that the region would have a lot of work to do if it were to sort of get itself up to speed. What I like also about the paper is that, that sort of, distinction between stages of development, right? And the results there found that infrastructure stood out as a key pillar for stage one countries. So I assume these are lower income countries. And macro stability institutions and innovations were top pillars in the higher income countries, stage two and stage three. So I think that was interesting. And I think it sits well in what we're seeing coming out of institutions like the World Bank, right? So last year, I think the World Bank in their World Economic Report did something similar, and what they found was that countries that are lower income, investment, and particularly investment in infrastructure, was the key driver of growth in those countries, whilst for upper middle income countries, um, they found that infusion and adaptation of technology and innovation were the major drivers. So again, I think this body of work sits nicely with the contemporary literature. And again, the paper presents, I think, strong and credible prescriptions and guidance on possible areas of policy intervention to support competitiveness and boost growth in the LAC region. So, two bits on the data that was used. I noticed that in the paper, you said that the GCI information ran up to 2019, but the sample period was 2007 to 2017, I think. So I was wondering, why we didn't include information up to 2019 in the sample. You did mention also about the sample size, right? And I know that when you sort of cut the sample and looked at the different countries in the different stages, there was one stage where there were just two countries, I think. But sample size is a challenge that I've identified. So thinking about how you could probably expand the sample, moving it beyond just LAC countries is one way to kind of shore up some estimation results. I had also an issue in terms of interpreting the results. So whilst I understand that the PIP indicates that the particular factor might be important, an important driver, and we see the posterior coefficients being reported as well, I wasn't clear on how to interpret it. Are they economically and statistically significant? So that's something that I think the paper could benefit from, a discussion around that. And then, thinking about alternative models. So I know that the challenge is to deal with this issue of dimensionality, but are there other models that we could consider? Principal component analysis, for example, is one thing that we could probably look at. And then for future work, because I think this work is really comprehensive already, the paper made mention of the different elements of the GCI perhaps being complementary to each other, right? So I know the paper looked at the impact of the different components, but how can we add interactions in the model possibly to understand the extent to which, pairings of these components can have impacts on competitiveness and growth? The other thing is, income is not necessarily the best delineator. So I know you kind of split the sample based on income. Could we consider also looking, or you could consider also looking at how you could split the sample based on other characteristics of the countries? So if you think about commodity exporting economies versus service-oriented economies, for example, the key drivers of competitiveness and growth in these economies might be very different. So that's something that you could look at. Again, as a region, we saw what happened in Jamaica with Hurricane Melissa. So the question of vulnerability and resilience is very relevant. You know, the implications or the impact of the different GCI components might be very different in countries that are high risk and highly vulnerable compared to countries that are low risk and don't have the same vulnerabilities. So I think these are interesting questions that could be examined, if not now, maybe in another iteration. And so again, all in all, I think it was an excellent presentation. It's a good start. It's a question that is, has befuddled the regional economists. So again, kudos, and looking forward to probably talking to you after to kind of flesh out any further comments that I might have.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dr. Small. So you are struggling to keep up with him by taking notes, but do you have any response to it? Yeah, yeah. I know you're struggling.
So thank you for those comments. They're very insightful. As it relates to the change in methodology, the sample period, there was actually a change in methodology in 2018, and there were just like two data points because like 2018 and 2019, and then the discontinuation in 2020. So I wasn't sure how to account for this inside of the base methodology. So I just decided to keep things simple, but going forward, I could actually explore that. As it relates to the sample size, yes, the sample for the stage one countries was relatively small. It only had 4 countries in stage one. And I guess that this would have led to some form of like bias result for that particular stage. As it relates to the posterior inclusion probability, I can look at clearing that up within the paper and making sure that it's more clearer as it relates to the robustness of the results. As it relates to the interaction term, including the pairing of the pillars, that was one of my ideas, but I just wanted to keep things very basic, but I can definitely explore that. Thank you for the results, and thank you for the comments, and I look forward to having further discussions with you.
Thanks for that. Opening to the floor for questions. Any questions?
Sure.
Delay, yes, Dr. Delay.
Yeah, let me say that how much I enjoyed the paper. I'm particularly delighted to find a paper that uses the GCI as the measure of competitiveness. Because the truth is that the IMF and most of the analysis that guides policy still regards the exchange rate as the thing that drives growth, even though we know that in countries like ours, that is not the case. If you devalue, our countries do not grow faster. But that is the basic idea behind the IMF adjustment model, right? And that is why flexible exchange rates is at the core of the IMF recommendations. I think that we have to understand that for our countries, and for all countries, competitiveness is a multifaceted notion. And the exchange rate really is irrelevant for competitiveness, for all countries. That's my view. So I, very much welcome the paper. I think the results are interesting. And I would, in general, like to suggest that we, as policymakers, we are not academic economists. We might be, academic economists. Some of us are academic economists, but most of us are advisors in research departments of central banks. We are advising people who are making policy. And we are using data which we all admit is iffy and insufficient and is subject to all kinds of qualifications. Robustness in empirical economics, I'm going to tell you after 50 years of doing it myself, is impossible. And it is not helpful to policymakers. Policymakers need results that can guide them in using the tools that they actually have to hand. And for that, I think that, so I just want to suggest that we don't worry too much about the robustness. Worry about the implications and what makes sense. Thank you.
Thank Dr. Earl for that comprehensive comment. We're going to take a break now. Group photos